Modi School of Management, Ahmedabad University. This webinar is a part of the conversation series webinar, and we have been running this webinar for the past 3 months. And today we have a very distinguished panel. I would not like to delay this and quickly introduce both the speakers. But before that, I would like to request to everybody, there are two things. One, that those people who are joining with their mobile, sometimes your handset name appears and not your real name. So I would request you to rename yourself, just check and rename. The reason is that you'll be asking questions, and I would request everybody to ask the question in the chat to everyone. So you can put your question in the chat to everyone so that others can see. And we also get to know who is asking the question rather than some iPhone or MI asking the question. That is the basic idea. So I request everyone to put your questions in the chat to everyone. There are two advantages. One, that all of us can see who is asking what question and we avoid the repetition. At the same time, one question can prompt other people to form another question, and the format becomes really interesting. These two speakers will interact and converse for an hour, and then after that, we'll take all the questions. But you can put your questions, we'll take it, and we'll address at the end of the conversation. So I'm very pleased to welcome two speakers. First, let me introduce, it is my real honor to introduce Professor Jeemol Unni. She's a professor of economics at Amrit Modi School of Management, Ahmedabad. Before joining Ahmedabad University, she was the director of the Institute of Rural Management, Anand, IRMA, and she was also RBI Chair Professor of Economics at IRMA. She was a postdoctoral fellow at Economic Growth Center, Yale University. She is currently a member of the Standing Committee on Economic Statistics constituted by the Government of India. She was an International Labour Organization consultant and senior advisor to the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, Government of India. She is a specialist in labor economics. Her special research focus is in the area of rural and urban labor market is on the informalization of labor and the production systems that the gender implications in the process. In addition, her research addresses issues of return to education and social protection to informal workers, including both social and economic securities and women entrepreneurship. She has been a member of the board of governors of a policy advocacy group on the informal economy, WIGO, registered as a charitable company in Manchester, UK. She is currently on the board of governors of several educational institutions in India. And one special thing about her, she writes a very popular blog. I follow that blog that is called Unni Universe. And I really love the way you describe things. I welcome you, ma'am, to speak on the topic, which is very close to a lot of people in this country, and they would really like to know what are your views on this particular issue, because you are an expert in that area, labor economics. Welcome. Now, the second distinguished speaker is Professor Chinmay Tumbe. A lot of you know him. He's an assistant professor in economics area at Indian Institute of Management, Ahmedabad. He's a very passionate person about migration, cities, and history. He's an alumnus of London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a doctoral, he did his FPM at the Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. He has also been a faculty member at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Hyderabad. He was in 2013, he was Jean Monnet Fellow at the Migration Policy Center, European University Institute for Florence. And in 2018, he was Alfred D. Chandler Jr. International Visiting Scholar in Business History at Harvard Business School. He has published widely on migration for a decade and has served on the policy-making groups. Notable is Working Group on Migration, Ministry of Housing and Urban Poverty Alleviation, 2016. He has written very interesting book. We all have read, most of us, India Moving. People call it a big book. So I just want to say that the big book shows the scale and variety of Indian migration and argues that greater mobility is a prerequisite for maintaining the country's pluralistic traditions. His course, Hitchhiker's Guide to Business and Economies across 5 centuries at IMA, is one of the most popular and loved courses. And we are thrilled to have you, Professor Chinmay, at our conversation series. So I welcome both of you and I give floor to you. You can begin.
Good evening, everyone. It's an honor to have all of you here. And it's happy to welcome Chinmay to Ahmedabad University's conversation series. Good afternoon to all the participants to the webinar from India. And good morning and good evening to participants from other parts of the world. And thank you all for joining us today. We hope you're going to enjoy the discussion. So the topic of the discussion today is crisis within a crisis, domestic migration in India. According to the Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy, CMI, an estimated 122 million people lost their jobs in April alone. So 3/4 of them were small traders and wage laborers, many of whom might have been migrants, both inter and intrastate migrants. We always knew that there are a large number of migrants in our cities. In Gujarat, where we live, Surat in particular is seen as the city of migrants. There are permanent migrants, many of us are, who have lived in the city for long periods, and we are unlikely to leave the city. But our concern here in this time of crisis is with the circular migration. So circular migration is a temporary and repeated, and it is generally for employment. It follows a similar pattern year on year within the state and across the state. Interstate migration in India was estimated to be about 9 million in the Economic Survey of India of 2017, in which Chinmay has also played a part. And this is most likely to be of the temporary variety. The Census of India 2011 has also given some estimates of internal migration and intrastate migration of a total of about 139 million. Of the total migrants, interstate migration consists about 56 million in 2011, which is the focus of our debate and also of the media today. Of the total, obviously the number would be much larger now. It's a decade since we had the last census. But as you can see, I'm getting a little ahead of myself. Migration is your topic of very intensive research, Chinmay. So I think we will move to Chinmay now, and we'll begin by talking about your book, India Moving, which is turning out to be an extremely popular book, where you describe patterns of migration in India. Your book is also very engaging, and let me say that unlike Sudhir, I have read it page to page. I read it over my travels when we were allowed to travel. So it's very engaging, and you have a series of maps on migration over time, and you also show some of the hotspots of migration. You also make this point that some of the patterns of migration have been similar over decades. Actually, very long ago, there was another book by an edited volume from the London School of Economics, which was a set of authors. Tim Dyson was the main author, and my professor, Professor Praveen Nasaria, was one of the co-authors. And I remember seeing one of these maps there, and they had very clear, and this is like, I'm sure it was like 20 years ago, very popular book. I had a chapter in that, and there are a lot of citations on that. So they, they showed these patterns of migration on a map. And at that point in time, I thought it was really fascinating. And it was what we see today, Bihar and UP moving towards Western India and so on. So Chinmay, shall we start with your trying to explain to us these patterns of migration and share one of those fascinating maps with us?
Sure, yeah. Firstly, thanks a lot for having me over, and absolutely privileged to have Professor Jeemol Unni, not very often that I'm in conversation with former directors of institute and so on. I'll just give a 2-minute introduction to migration and then go on to the map and explain what or how to understand migration in India. The first thing to understand is who is migrating in India before we understand where people are migrating from. And in India, if the classic dimensions of identity, men, women, caste, religion, language, these are really fascinating attributes, and we all have stereotypes. So, for example, the classic stereotype of the Keralite. Right? So the Keralite who is found everywhere. There's a joke. I think when India won this T20 World Cup, Sreesanth caught this catch somewhere, and the joke was, Misbah-ul-Haq, he didn't take into account that Keralites can be anywhere. These are kind of popular jokes which come about. You have the similar jokes on Biharis. You have similar sort of attributes. For example, if you look at plumbing as an occupation in India, Odia plumbers all over India. Secretarial positions, Keralites, overwhelming. You go to particular countries in East Africa and you find Gujaratis, right? You find Punjabis in Italy and Canada. And so there are these particular clusters which emerge in migration, and they don't happen immediately over 1 or 2 years. It takes time, takes decades, and I'm going to argue that it takes centuries. And intuitively, we know migration is a very fascinating subject, because most of the people on this call are likely to be migrants, either first generation, second generation, third generation. And we kind of, have our own experiences of migration. That is why what we're going to eventually talk about, which is the crisis, I think also hits hard for those who have moved, because we realize that, it could very well have been us. If, for example, we were stuck in other countries, we would have been facing very, very similar problems. If we were stuck in another country with no money, with no accommodation, and no way to come back, I think that's the way to empathize with the crisis that we're going to talk about. So what I'll do now is, just share a screen with you all. Can you see this?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a map I like to show on migration to understand where people are moving from. It's called, hotspots of migration. The map is on my website, and if you just search migration research, Chinmay, you'll get this. And this website, by the way, also has a ton of resources on migration, bibliographies, websites, links, etc. And so I'm going to stick on this particular map. And this is a map on out migration. So it doesn't tell you where people are moving to, it tells you where people are moving from. And of course, that's important for our discussion, because you'll see that, all the protests which happen in cities and so on happen in particular cities, particular source region states. So it's important to understand where those people are coming from. Now, this map, if I just showed you this map and you forget the 4 circles which are drawn inside, you'll see one thing very quickly, and that is that much of central India, which is the Deccan Plateau, is kind of locked out. So just to explain this map, it's a district level map, and it's deliberately given at the district level. So, she mentioned this wonderful work by Dyson, Desaria, and so on, but most of those were state level maps. So we know, for example, Bihar has a lot of out migration and so on. But it's really the district level map of India that, gives you a very varied structure, because in every state of India, whether rich or poor, you will find at least one district which is sending a lot of people out. Right? And that's remarkable, because it's not the case that, it's just the poorest parts of India sending people out. In fact, the first thing you'll see on this map is this remarkable aspect that India's richest part, which is this entire west coast, which you see out here. So it's not just Kerala, but from Kanyakumari to Bombay, this entire one side of the Western Ghats is marked red. You'll find a few, non-reds out here, but broadly it's red. And what you'll find is that this is a place of, massive out migration, which has very long routes. And this is, if you actually go to these parts of India, you'll find complaints about shortage of labor. But this is not the poorest part of India from any stretch. In fact, on most counts, on literacy, on a variety of things, it is in fact India's most developed part. Not just Kerala, but this entire stretch, Udupi, Goa, there are parts of Goa with massive out migration, and even to some extent the Konkan region. So India's richest part, right, has mass out migration, and the numbers are very stark. The red shaded regions on this district is basically, we're saying more than 25% of households in those districts send out people for work. Right? Which means if you're walking on a street in one of those villages or even small towns, 1 in 4 households has somebody outside. Right? So that's a very high number in migration studies. In contrast with, say, a district like here in Madhya Pradesh, which is less than 10%, in fact, it's something like 1 or 2%. It means virtually every village that you go, when you walk in those households, there's virtually nobody who has somebody out for work. So very stark differences, in terms of the geography of migration. And what you realize is that there's this one cluster here, which is India's richest part. And then you have this one massive cluster here, which is eastern Uttar Pradesh, not all of Uttar Pradesh, but eastern Uttar Pradesh and Bihar. This is, we say, the world's largest source region of migrant workers. It has been sending out people for a very long time, and so on. Now, what's really interesting is that this is also widely considered to be one of the poorest parts of India. Right? So you have this sort of paradox that India's poorest part, which is this region, roughly, relatively, and India's richest part, which is the west coast, actually have the same rates of out migration. Right? So that should warn us very quickly that this migration story is not just about poverty. Right? So there are many other things that drive migration, because you have this cluster. But both these regions do have something which is in common, and that commonality is population density. So both the west coast of India and this Gangetic plain out here is very, very striking for its high rural population density. And why that matters is because there's only that much that agriculture can support. And now we are seeing that as so many of these migrants have gone back, it's very difficult to support livelihoods in such large numbers. And so historically, these regions have been natural sort of, labor pools or surplus labor pools from which people have been moving out. And when they move out, they move through networks. Most of these guys do not, in fact, move through contractors. I'll talk about contractors in a bit. They're going through particular family and friend networks, as a result of which, these corridors develop over time, which are, remarkably resistant for not only decades, but even more than a century. I've talked about two clusters. Let me talk about a third cluster, which is coastal Orissa. And I'm right now in the state of Gujarat. I believe many of you on this call are from Gujarat. And this entire cluster out here, 100 years back, it was still the same map, mass migration towards Burma. This is one of the largest migration waves that happened at that time. And today it's turned completely other way around, and they all come to Gujarat. Okay, so I mean, not all, obviously, maybe a lot of people are going to all parts of India, but Gujarat absorbs the bulk of labor coming from Odisha, for example. Okay, and there's one district called Ganjam, which now is in the news for high COVID cases in relative terms within Orissa, has this huge connection to Gujarat. And the question is, how did these corridors emerge? Because we're saying about 100 years back they're going to Burma. In the case of coastal Orissa, it's interesting. This is a region which has been battered by cyclones. Every 5 or 10 years, you get not just a cyclone, but a super cyclone. So there's this natural calamity which is well entrenched in people's psychology. And so migration, despite the horrible scenes that we've seen, despite the volatility and uncertainty, is actually, in many parts of India, a very stable livelihood strategy. Because remember, rural areas themselves face a lot of volatility. Right? So you have rainfall issues, sometimes it rains, sometimes it doesn't. In Orissa, you have cyclones, in Bihar and UP, you have floods. So this climatic shock entrenched in psychology such that migration is a stable strategy is very entrenched in some parts of India. There are some other regions. Let me talk about Rajasthan. This is not as ancient as these other ones. So the other ones we're saying are more than 100 years old. And note, what I'm saying is the same out-migration rates for more than 100 years. Right? And you can see this classically in sex ratios. I've called it the missing men phenomenon. Basically, the sex ratios of these districts have female surplus because the men are outside. And you can see the sex ratio statistics which are elevated for more than 100 years. Now you have Rajasthan, which is relatively more recent. You have the famous Shekhawat, a region which sent out a lot of the people whom we now know as Marwadis. Marwadis, you should remember, it's a misnomer. Most of the Marwadis that you see outside trace their origin to Shekhawat, not Marwar, which is out here on the west. But a lot of Rajasthan today sends out labor. And where do they send it out to? It sends it out to Gujarat, the neighboring place, cities like where I am based in Ahmedabad, but also from around Jaipur, people go to Delhi, the major cities of India. Then you have a Himalayan cluster. And this map is about India. It's about the National Sample Survey data from 2008, slightly dated, but not much would have changed since then. That is my argument. The Himalayan states of Uttarakhand and Himachal, and if you extend it to Nepal, Nepal we don't have data because it's an Indian survey, but entire belt from Nepal, Uttarakhand and Himachal has a lot of out-migration. And where are people going from? Nepal, they're going now mostly to the Gulf. So people are coming to India also, but that India channel has reduced. But from Uttarakhand and Himachal, people are going mostly to Delhi. And that's a huge, so where are the guys who are going out from these red shaded districts? What jobs do they do? They're mostly working in the urban informal economy, but they are not, and I should repeat, the poorest of the poor. Okay, they are not, for example, necessarily the sort of brick kiln workers or the construction workers. These are guys who are working in restaurants. These are guys who are working in trade, in the entire service sector, and of course manufacturing clusters like in Surat, for example, in Tirupur in the south, or Ludhiana in Punjab, and so on. So if you think about where you stay, if you're staying in a building complex, the security guard, think of the security guard as the most classic example of these migration. And who are these migrants? They're almost always men. So it's overwhelmingly dominated by men in most parts of India. In some places, it's more gender balanced. They do not usually settle down in the cities, which means they are semi-permanent migrations. That is, they come to the city, they work maybe for 20 years in between going home every holiday, but eventually, they don't settle down in the city that they've gone to. They go back to their village or the small town that they've come from. Right? And so this is this massive circular migration which is happening. And the psychology of this migration is such that people are saving in order to remit money back home. So the whole strategy, the whole psychology is to come make as much money as possible and send it back. And this conditions living strategies. For example, you want to cut down on accommodation costs, so you don't mind living in really bad conditions, because the whole objective is to save and send back money. You don't you share your accommodation with a lot of people in order to cut down money. You eat in these large messes in order to drive down unit costs and save money. So this is the psychology of circular migration. And the numbers are very stark. I'll talk about the numbers in a bit. Now, in the Northeast, before I just finish this map, in the Northeast, you have a few districts, but broadly, historically, the Northeast was seen as a place which absorbs migrant labor. And you should know that Assam and the surrounding region between about 1880 and 1940 was in a way the world's fastest growing region demographic. Mass migration, immigration, however you want to call it, to Assam. So this region has historically been absorbing labor in the tea plantations and a variety of other things. But of late, of course, people have been moving out from the Northeast for education and other factors. And then there's this whole part of central India, the Deccan Plateau and so on, which is not really well covered on the map. But there are some districts, of course, which matter. For example, Mehboob Nagar in Telangana now, or you find Bijapur, Raichur in Gulbarga in Karnataka, northern Karnataka. You have districts in Maharashtra like Sangli. You have this entire cluster at the border of Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh. But if you see, I've drawn these 4 circles out here to basically pinpoint certain clusters with mass outmigration. But you'll see that they are not reflected in the map in terms of mass outmigration. And that's because the kind of migration that they're doing is very different. These are now the short-term seasonal migrants who move for very few months of the year, 2, 3, or maybe even 4 months of the year. And they are working in the construction sector. They are working in the bricking sector in large numbers. These are the guys who are basically at the most exploitative ends of the migration channels. They are completely migrating through contractors mostly. So contractors kind of influence the migration chain. I'm not saying contractors don't influence migration from other parts of India, but it's especially entrenched in these 4 circles. So this is a quick sort of roundabout, introduction to the geography of migration in India. And the history of this is, of course, population density, but interestingly also where the British recruited in the late 19th century for their factories, for their plantations, especially outside India. If you have heard of V.S. Naipaul, how did he reach the Caribbean? His ancestral sort of connections tie up with Eastern UP. And so a lot of people who got to Mauritius, Fiji, this was a particular channel of mass migration wave in the late 19th century, which drew, and where did the British recruit from? Particular recruitment centers in Eastern UP, Bihar. You take people, of course, from Calcutta as well. The Orissa connection developed to Burma. From even Tamil Nadu, coastal Tamil Nadu, people went to Sri Lanka, Malaysia, and Burma. So in terms of the historical sort of channels, 100 years back, this cluster on the eastern seaboard mostly went either to Calcutta, either to Rangoon, which is in Burma, either to Malaysia, either to Sri Lanka, or the plantation world. So this was, the eastern board was pretty much the migration hotspot of India 100 years back, and they were mostly going east. What has changed over the 20th century is that they've mostly started going west. Right? So they're from UP, Bihar. Now, very few actually go to Calcutta. Most are going to Delhi, most are going to Bombay, Surat, or to some matter south. And what we've seen in the last 20 years now is this dramatic new development of people moving from North India to South India. And that's happening because fundamentally migration is also driven by wage differentials. So you're getting much higher wage now, real wage in South India. And so people are moving now from the north to the south. So in terms of, for example, if you want to understand, how are these people, I mean, this is a map on region, it's on geography. How does it cut across, say, caste? Is it the fact that, the lower ranking castes in India migrate more or less? And I would say that that depends, hugely on region. So for example, let me take this region called Ratnagiri. It's a district I've studied closely. And, Kalyani Vartak, who did a PhD on this, and I have done some work. And we looked at a particular, part of Ratnagiri. And what we found was that in the last 50 years, the early migrations almost everywhere in India, the first people to leave the villages permanently were relatively the upper ranking castes. But what's happened in many of these places of mass migration is that now everyone migrates. And so you often find a village where there are literally no caste differences in terms of the propensity to migrate. And a lot of them have come up through migration. So what we found was dramatic upward mobility, for example, the Mahars in Ratnagiri, through migration, but it has not changed inequality. Right? So it has not changed the fundamental nature. For example, who owns land in a particular village that we studied has not changed at all in the last 50 years. Where people live within the village has not changed. But absolute poverty is pretty much non-existent. So everyone has kind of moved up, but arguably some have, the people who are better off to start with have maintained that relative sort of position. So what we're saying is that migration can be in many parts of India a hugely powerful way to come up, even if it maintains the pecking order to a certain extent in terms of classic indicators like land ownership and so on. That's not to say that there's no voice. What we found in Ratnagiri is a lot of assertion, a lot of voice, which comes through money, and so migration in that sense is also very useful. I'm trying to think of interesting clusters. There's one cluster here in Punjab, and I'll just end this note by talking about this cluster. This is a cluster around Hoshiarpur, and it's been sending out people now for more than 100 years. But people today go mainly to Canada and mainly to Italy, right? And so this is a huge sort of out migration hotspot of India, and it is not necessarily the poorest part of India. It is not necessarily the most agriculturally sort of poor part of India, but these migration connections are very rich. Now, in terms of the cities where they're going to, all the major cities absorb a lot of migrants, but I should note that there's a fundamental difference. And I've been arguing that 3 cities of India are quite different, and they're similar and different from others, and that's Delhi, Surat, and Mumbai. Right? And why are they different from Chennai, Bangalore, Pune, Hyderabad, Kolkata even? Is because firstly, the percentage of migrants in urban India overall is roughly about 30%. Okay, let's take that as a number, roughly. 30% of urban India is migrant, which means people coming from outside. But in these cities like Delhi, Mumbai, and Surat, that number is almost more than 50%. In Surat, in fact, one number at one point was 70%. That's 70% of the city. But it's not just who is coming, it is where the migrants coming from. Right? And we find in Delhi, Mumbai, and Surat, more than half the migrants come from the rural areas. So this is your classic rural to urban migration, which is your classic developmental process of moving out labor from rural areas to urban areas, what we've seen in China, for example. Whereas actually, if you see Bangalore, if you see Hyderabad, Chennai, Pune, the so-called IT hubs, the bulk of the migrant workforce actually comes from other urban areas. Right? And so we're talking of a phenomenon of urban to urban migration. And that doesn't fundamentally change urbanization. So people are just moving within sort of urban areas. And that's important because it gives a very different texture to the cities. And what I will argue is, when we talk about the crisis, that is who wanted to go back. Not surprisingly, we saw the protests in large numbers coming in Delhi, in Surat, and Mumbai, right? Because they had rural connections, which conditions migration strategies slightly differently, and they had much higher shares of migrant workforce in those cities than in other places. So I'll stop here with this overall introduction. I think I've gone taking 15 minutes, but let's continue the conversation. Yeah. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Chinmay, for that very fascinating account of the patterns of migration. I can't help asking this question, but you don't have to answer it. Your source of that data is the NSSO. If you say NSSO 2007-8, my ears and will stand up, my eyes will pop out. So how did you get district level data? Because their data is generally at the regional level.
Yeah. It's actually, by the time the 2007-8 survey came, you could actually estimate, you could get unbiased estimates at the district level. There was a paper in 2004, I remember, in the EPW, which showed, which calculated poverty rates and so on. But more interestingly, there has been a lot of validation done to this data. So I'm very skeptical of any data. And what's remarkable is that the NSS district level data corresponds very well, almost 1-to-1, the map I showed you, with the sex ratio data of the census. Right? And what is the sex ratio data? We know sex ratio depends on many things. But if you take the working age sex ratio as a proportion of the child sex ratio, because what happens is the men move at a particular age group. Right? So if you take the difference, for example, the sex ratio, say, in the 0 to 20 age group is, say, 800, and the sex ratio 800 females to 1,000 males, and the sex ratio in the 20 to 40 age group in a district like Ratnagiri will shoot up to 1,200. Right? So that difference between 800 and 1,200 is because the men have moved out. Right? So you can actually take that percentage difference, and it turns out that I have a chapter on this called Missing Men, Migration and Sex Ratios, which compares this NSS data with the census data on sex ratios. And there's a very nice match. So the missing men phenomenon, this is a map of the missing men phenomenon, is not just an NSS story. It comes from the census. I've compiled a bibliography of more than 3,000 studies on migration. Those who are looking at this, it's on my website. Migration has been studied in India by a variety of people. And what I've also done is to validate what the map is saying from the studies. And not surprisingly, most of the studies have been in precisely those places which have seen out-migration, very high out-migration. There's a lot of anecdotal level field surveys done. So this is a map which I have a lot of confidence in. Obviously not each and every district, but the general idea of the map, I think, compares very well with a variety of data sources. Yeah.
Sure, thanks. All right, so now the topic of today is the current pandemic. But I know that you're an economic historian and you have been working on issues related to the pandemic of 2018 and maybe other pandemics as well. So can you tell us about the 1918 flu and its impact on the population in India? And do you see any similarities with what we are seeing today in the current pandemic?
Yeah, so what I'll talk about is two pandemics very quickly. For those who don't know, and this I'm doing work on this right now, which will be out in a few months. India was battered by pandemics between 1817 and 1920. This is a period of time in Indian history where typically if you ask, what happened in India, everyone would say colonial rule. And the fundamental fear of the Indians was the British. And what I'm arguing is that no, the fundamental fear of both the Indians and the British was pandemics. And it's remarkably been slipped out of history. There was the cholera pandemics from 1817 onwards, the plague pandemics from 1896 in India, and 1918 influenza pandemic, which actually affected the world for only a few months, though it actually killed more people than the plague and cholera pandemics combined. And to give you a sense of what happened in those times, plague, for those who don't know, is it's a rodent carried sort of a disease which passes on to humans. A lot of people think it has something to do with Bombay city. It came there in 1896, but the bulk of the plague victims were eventually in the province of Punjab, province of Uttar Pradesh, that is United Province back then, and the presidency of Bombay. It killed about 12 million people, 12 million Indians between 1896 and 1920. And what's really remarkable of this, and we call it a pandemic because it affected not only India, but also other countries, especially China. And because we're talking about the crisis now, let me give you some really nice, tidbits about this, big question of the crisis. Firstly, why did we get the crisis that we saw in the month of, March and April? The fundamental reason was that the railways were shut down, right? In the sense that if the railways was not shut down, people would have gone back, or if you had given some time for people to go back, you would not have seen the craziness that what we saw. You would have seen people from railway stations, but you not see people walking 1,000 kilometers and so on. And so there's a huge issue in public policy. Do you shut down the railways or not? And so here the 1896 plague is very interesting. It attacked Bombay and people were scared and so on. And the British actually deliberated on this. And so you actually have good evidence on, the British thinking through what happens if we shut down the railways. Because by the way, the railways had, started from the 1850s. It was quite extensive by the 1890s. And the British said, no, we should not shut down the railways. And the reasons they gave was very simple. They're saying, if we shut down the railways, it won't make a difference because people will still go back. Right? And it's remarkably prophetic and remarkably accurate. Okay, that is, it doesn't matter because people go back. And why? Because they said, people are so poor in the cities that they simply don't have the holding capacity to stay in the city with an effective lockdown, which the plague had, in a way implied, that people would anyway go back. The second reason, also very interesting, was it would, and I quote, is that it would cause hardship and inconvenience. Right? Now, the British messed up a lot on the plague, to the extent that in Pune, you had this famous assassination, and there was a sedition case against Tilak, a lot of drama or political drama during the plague. But on the question of migration, the British actually took this line saying, let people go back. And eventually what happened was in the city of Bombay, half the population emptied out. So from a population of about 800,000, 400,000 people actually left Bombay, in the months of roughly till February 1897. And about 6 months later, they were back. Right? And so this is again a classic question now. People asking, are people going to come back? Yes, back then they did, because simply put, there was nothing else to do back home. I should also add, though, that in 1896-97, there was a famine in the countryside. So people, the choice there was escaping plague in the city or the famine in the countryside. And so it was between the devil and the sea. Now, another incident on plague, which comes from China. And here, actually, the Chinese actually shut down the railways. So you have both cases. You have the case of the Indians who actually thought, or the British who thought through of not shutting down the railways. And this happened in 1911. So the pneumonic plague outbreak in Manchuria in northeast China. And the railways were shut down. And this was a railway which connected Russia and China. And what did you see? And this was, freezing winter. In January 1911, what the British had said for India happened in China. That is, people left the cities and they actually walked, and it was winter and people died on the way back. So you had mass mortality, not because of the disease, but because of people walking back. So it's actually the historical precedence on this major public policy question is very, very stark. Right? Coming now to the flu was very short term. So I should tell you a bit about the background of the flu. The flu, in terms of its transmission, is very similar to what we're seeing today. That is, in terms of a public policy question, ideally people should have been wearing masks. There were pronouncements on wearing masks back then also, but not as much as now. I said the plague killed 12 million people between 1896 and 1920. The flu killed globally about 40 million people plus. It's the world's greatest pandemic ever, however you see. But India, it killed 20 million people. Now, these are my estimates, but the estimates have typically ranged from 10 to 20 million, and I now have a working paper arguing that it's 20 million. But so even if it's 10 million, it's a lot, right? And this is the world's greatest demographic disaster, which has happened for any country, barring maybe the Chinese famine of 1950s or something. So it's either the greatest or the second greatest. 20 million people dying in literally a few months between September 1918 and about February 1919, right? And what's again remarkable here is, the remarkable virulence of that disease, which we now know was an H1N1 disease. People had no clue what had hit them. It was also at the end of World War I, right?
Right.
But what's interesting is, the question people have been asking, and now I'm providing an explanation in my work, is why did so many Indians die? You didn't see such high mortality in other countries. And the answer comes from nutrition, in the sense that the flu acted upon seriously undernourished bodies. And so it so happens that 1918 was also a year of a massive rainfall shock, that is a drought. So in Indian history, the three worst rainfall years in Indian history since 1870 and now happened back then. After 1920, though we say climate change, more variability, the worst rainfall years in Indian history were 1877, 1899, and 1918. And not surprisingly, in the first two, there were massive famines, which have been well documented. But in 1918, actually, there was no famine per se, though in some parts it was declared, for the simple reason that the flu killed so many people. Right? So before it could lead up to famine conditions, the flu sort of killed up. And what happened was immediately, because of rains, when short supply in June, July, the prices of food grains went up. And what I'm showing in my work is that wherever the prices went up dramatically, you saw massive mortality. So people were priced out of the food market, simply didn't have nutrition. And the lesson from that is that the fundamental focus in any pandemic management, whatever you do, is to ensure that you have people, basically nourished. Because huge literature shows that diseases work on nutrition. Right? So you don't want to take any steps, and this is again now reflecting on today's crisis, because what we got fundamentally after taking this decision on migration was a situation where people were being undernourished. Right? So you had suddenly people in these camps, people walking, people stranded. It is the exact opposite of what anybody would want in a pandemic. Right? Luckily, this year, India is sitting on record high food grain stocks, so we don't have the same issue that the government faced in 1918. There was the World War I was raging at that point, so the attention of the British was more on the war effort. So we lucky that we don't have any of those issues. and we are not going to see, hopefully, famine conditions in India. But again, we almost pushed people to the brink in many places, which could have then, easily been a disaster. And so that's a lesson we get from the flu. Now, the question of, the idea of shutting down the railways, of not letting people go back, is of course very noble, because the whole idea being that you don't want to spread the diseases back. Right? And this is, and so I can imagine epidemiologists sort of arguing this, and there might be, very good reasons for this. Now, the British had taken the call that this is, in 1896, that this might be useful, but it won't work because people will anyway go back. And here I want to make this distinction between internal migration and international migration. In international migration, you can shut down much more effectively because you have few checkpoints, you can seal it off very quickly. And because the distances are longer, you can't simply walk back. So if you're stuck in the Gulf, you're stuck in the US, you can't do anything. But if you're stuck in Mumbai, you're stuck in Delhi, you can walk. You can do something in order to get back. Right? So it's very difficult to curtail internal mobility by force, as the British argued, vis-a-vis international migration. Right? So it's much easier to shut down international borders than internal borders. Now, a lot of people say that the flu of 1918 in India spread precisely because of the railways. Right? And there is merit to this fact as well. Even in the times of a plague, it did spread. So shouldn't the railways have been shut down? It so again turns out that in 1918, the flu was so virulent that the counterfactual that there was no railways doesn't seem to matter. Even with little, movement, it would have spread like wildfire. And the argument for that comes from what happened around the world. In Iran, for example, which did not really have a railway network, Iran had even worse casualty rates as a percentage of its population than India. So it turned out that that disease was just so virulent that it didn't really matter whether you had the railways or not. Even with some distance between human beings, it would pass. Right? And so, the flu killed off people in remote Alaska. It killed off people in islands in Oceania. It was in fact so virulent that a Nobel-worthy physicist, Fred Hoyle, famously, made this argument that it came from outer space. That there's no way that this flu was, because it was so contagious that, it almost as if somebody sprinkled it from the top and everyone got it. Right? But there's a good counter argument to that, because there were some islands in the world which did not, get the flu at all, and that's because no ship ever went there. So it was always because a person took it to a particular place. But virtually all of the world got it. So in March this year, the government of India had to make a choice, and a very tough choice. And I'll give you the counterfactuals. For example, suppose the government had not taken this step of shutting down the railway so dramatically, and suppose this disease was much more virulent. Suppose the disease was in fact very lethal. And suppose, it traveled very quickly through the railways, we would be cursing the government for not shutting down the railways, right? So there are these, so I don't want to, just, criticize, on the sake of it. These are very hard policy trade-offs. But my sense is that given the numbers in India, I'll give you 3 arguments as to why in any pandemic in India in the coming future, you should let people go home first. Right? The first is the same that the British said. We don't have the holding capacity for migrants. Right? Now, this can, of course, be improved by better social security, better engagement, and so on. Right? And where we erred was that the Prime Minister's speech actually did not include anything for migration. So, for example, on March 24th, if the announcement said that, because the announcement just said everyone stay at home. And migrants took it very literally because their home is, the rural places. So they said stay at home means time to go back. Right? But if there was a clearer messaging that is, we will do what it takes, like what the central bank often said. We will do what it takes to feed you, but just be here for a few weeks. That was an issue. Second, there's a time inconsistency problem. That is, at the time of announcement, you simply don't know how long this lockdown is going to go. And the government was convinced that it's going to be a 3-week lockdown. In fact, in the first few days, remember, there was rumors that it might be extended. And the government said, no, these are rumors. We will not extend it more than 15 days. In the event, they had to extend. And that's when the migrants really lost it. Right? Because they said, okay, we can last for a few weeks. If we're going to make it 50 days, there's no way we can last. And that's when the crisis really. So there's a time inconsistency problem. That is, you simply don't know how long you're going to be in this lockdown. The third reason is also pragmatic. That is, because cities are high density places, actually by letting people go back, you're decongesting, you're de-densifying cities. And pandemics thrive on density. Right? So in that is also a good argument for sending people back home. The fourth being economic. That is, if you send back home people before the lockdown, after the lockdown, they can actually come back. What we had was this remarkable case where after the lockdown was being taken back, people were going back. So in a way, by not sending our migrants back home earlier, we have actually now delayed our economic recovery. Right? Because of course, a lockdown is important. It has to be done. But at some point, you need to remove the lockdown and get on with economic activities. For that, you need a migrant workforce. And today, and that is why, this is a very good title, a crisis within a crisis, because it's not a crisis which is over. Right? There are millions of migrants sitting in villages in India, unemployed, waiting to come back to cities. But they're not, because many of them have just gone back, and they're going to come back only a bit later. So all in all, it is my view that the government should have, as I said, hard policy trade-offs. You can, whatever the government does, we would have criticized. But in this particular case, I think the historical precedents, the sheer number of migrants in India means that it was a wrong step to shut down the railway so dramatically. We should have given a week. And remember, in terms of the planning, I mean, we got 4 days to bang plates in the balconies. The government of India rescued internationally stranded migrants between 15th March and 24th March. And the migrants saw this. That added to the desperation. That is, it was hypocritical to go and send our planes to send back people and then tell our migrants, no, you cannot go home. And it was this jarring hypocrisy which really hurt a lot of people. And in the event, once the lockdowns kept getting extended, once even in many places the food did not reach, there was a sense of desperation. I'll just end this note by saying there's also cultural factor. Right? So one is the economic, that is of not being able to survive. But a lot of people in times of a crisis say, this saying, which by the way was heard in Bombay as well, 100 years back, it's on record, saying that the people in the railway station were saying, marna hi hai to gaon mein marenge. That is, if you want to die anyways, we'd rather die at our villages. And this again ties with a very crucial aspect of why migration in India is very circular, because people want to end their lives at their ancestral homes. Right? And so this is a very strong cultural imperative for people to go back during the crisis. And that's a sentiment a lot of people heard even this time around. So all in all, I think history again is very important, because there were historical precedents to this act, and I think a careful understanding of what could have happened might have averted the mass tragedy. I have estimated that about 30 million people went back, right? Most of them within states, but the number could be 15 million. We know 5 million went back for sure from the Shramik trains, but beyond that, so 30 million is about 15 to 20% of the urban workforce. Some of them have come back, but we are still staring at about 10 to 15% shortfall in our cities right now. So our economic recovery, let's say we're going to have a minus 5% GDP growth this year. I think it's only minus 10 or so. That number actually depends hugely on the migrant workforce. And because they're not there, every day that they're not there, that number is going to slide down more to the left. And so that is why migration is not only important from a sort of, the health issue, but also from the economic side, right? Because they contribute so much to our economies. Mute.
Thanks a lot, Chinmay. I mean, that was quite a fascinating story about the earlier, pandemics as well. So now, since we have this thing as crisis versus within a crisis, you have spoken about quite a lot of it already. How is this crisis different from what they had at that point in time? 1918 was also going through a crisis. You had the war, and you also spoke about the shortfall in food and so on and so forth. But this time we've been having a slowdown of the economy already, as you know. Now, how is this going to affect, and how are we ever going to come out of this? And regarding the policies adopted, how did India actually manage to contain the flu, or it just ran out of steam? And how do you think we are trying to do it now?
Yeah, I mean, very, very pertinent questions. I would say, so I'll talk to the flu first, the economic side of the flu. Yes. The flu started with the drought. That is, if the sequence of events was the drought first, then the flu. And here's a good point. There wasn't really much intervention. Yes, a lot of people, a lot of state government shut down activities. You couldn't go to the cinema halls. You couldn't publicly congregate. Religious places were shut down and so on. So there were interventions taken on those lines. But the flu was much more deadly. Let's just say it was much more deadly. Based on the current evidence of the coronavirus, it was much more. I don't want to scare you all, but I should say that the flu came in 2 waves, right? So the first wave came earlier in the year, and that did not kill too many people. It really started off in September. So you have to be in August, just for coincidence sake. But, I mean, it's not that every virus comes in waves and so on. But in the case of the influenza view of that year, it came in 2 distinct waves. And it's the second wave which proved to be the killer one. And some would argue that people got complacent with the first wave, saying, it wasn't a big deal. And then the second wave really knocked out. Did India get lucky? If you see the data, it's very clear that the flu went everywhere, but it did not kill people everywhere. And where it killed, I argue that it was because of nutrition. So for example, if you look, and there's very interesting data which is kept by the British. The data comes from cantonments. Because see, in the general population at that time, there's simply no way to know how many people contracted the flu. You can measure deaths, but you can't really measure, how many people, because not everyone's going to the hospital and so on. But you can do that in cantonments, because the British, were there and soldiers, and you can do that in jails, because that's also a bureaucratic space vacancy. So you have data from jails and you have data from cantonments, and that clearly tells you that across India, people got the flu, but only in some places, people died in large numbers, and in the army. Actually, very few people died across India. Why? Because they were well nourished. So Indian troops, didn't die as much in even the Punjab, which was heavily hit by the flu, as much as the general population, because arguably they were better nourished. So in that sense, on hindsight, the strategy there should have been to give enough nourishment to everyone, which means food management was actually a more critical strategy. And the takeaway from that is that this year, just because we have record food grain stocks, doesn't mean that people are actually getting those stocks. One has to continuously monitor that nutrition is people are being well nourished. What happened then was interesting. Because 20 million people died, that was about 6% of the population, there was simply no farmhands. So the next crop in the year completely failed. So you had one of the worst recessions of the wheat crop, because North India and West India, to give you the geography of the flu, West and North India were massively hit. East and South India were spared to a large extent. And it really, the flu came into India in a big way from the city of Bombay. Overall, the economic contraction measured by Siva Subramanian, who's a famous economic historian, was 10%. So 10% GDP fall. So the real GDP of India fell by about 10%. Now, the only good news from this tragedy is that the next year, the economy bounced back by 10%. Right? So for everyone and that's like a base effect, because the economy kind of gets back together. So the economy, arguably, let's say this virus, peters out by the end of this year. This year is a washout. You might get -5, -10, -15, -20% GDP growth. But if it's contained within the year, then the next year, we know is a base effect. You might see a 20% GDP growth next year. The difference between the last time and now is prices more than output. And inflation that year in 1918 was 30%. And that was the highest on record between roughly 1870 and 1939. So in that 80-year period, 1918, 1919 was the worst year in terms of prices. Right? And that's what priced out people of the market. And we are seeing small elements of that. Obviously, we're not going to have 30% inflation. Oil prices have crashed. But you see food prices, and they went up. And they went up precisely because of the lockdown and disruption in the supply side. Right? And that's why it's gone beyond this 6% now. So one has to closely monitor prices and output. This year, we will see an economic contraction, maybe even surpassing 1918 or less, but it's going to be negative, we know that. But prices won't be that bad. Now, obviously, we will get out of this. And, even in the 1920s, after the flu, was a reasonably good time for the Indian economy. I mean, the economy, at least for a few years before the Great Depression, it chugged along. We, of course, unfortunately, are in a world where there's also sort of pressures on deglobalization. Overall, world economy is slow. So, though next year we will have this massive base effect growth, getting back on real growth is a very tricky and challenging task, because as you rightly pointed out, Indian economy was tanking before the crisis or before the lockdown, right? That is, there were, I think, 6 quarters of falling growth as we moved into the lockdown quarter. So clearly there's something wrong even at the fundamental level, which needs to be addressed.
Thanks a lot. I think the point that you're making about nutrition and food availability, I think, is an extremely important point. And the fact that, we have had some distribution through the public distribution system, but I don't think it's been good enough. And we need to do a lot more of that to make sure that at least the deaths due to nutrition don't happen.
Absolutely. And these could be non-COVID related deaths. And that is another aspect of the measurement. That is, and that is why a lot of us have signed a petition for basically releasing the death data. Right? So right now, all we see is the COVID data on deaths. But ideally, what can happen is you can get deaths by other causes, right? Because of related, which might not be measured. But so ideally, when you calculate excess deaths, you want a wider sample. Though I should say that this year it might be the case that the economic contraction is going to be much more painful in terms of the overall picture than the actual mortality loss. Right now we're at 40,000 deaths, which is bad, but in relative terms to past pandemics, it's nothing. Right? We're talking of 20 million dying in a few months vis-a-vis 40,000. So that comparison between the past and today is the only other point I want to make from this reflection of the past is we tend to draw inferences from regional variation very quickly. So so we're seeing that Kerala is doing great, Gujarat is doing badly, or Bombay is doing really badly because so many COVID cases and so on. And the more I'm reading about past pandemics, it's clear that all of this is premature. Why some countries got more COVID mortality than others, why some parts of India got more COVID mortality than others. Pandemic management is only one part of the story. A variety of other factors. It could be climatic. It could be the nature of the disease itself. It could be nature of existing level of immunity. Variety of reasons. But I think two things we have to be guarded against: a premature celebration that it's over. That has come back to haunt all previous governments who managed pandemics. In 1896, when they said plague is over, the municipal corporation said now it's over, and then next 20 years they had to deal with the issue. So that was the kind of craziness. And secondly is to celebrate, saying, because we don't have plague at that time, or we don't have COVID, that means we're doing something right. If I think the best thing is to just keep quiet. If it's very high, like in the US, we know that something is wrong. But just because it's low doesn't mean that you're doing something right.
You're doing things right. Yeah, thank you. So I think we'll start moving towards the questions because of this. But I just wanted to say that Chinmay, you're a very brave economist. You're making a lot of predictions with regard to the GDP and also with regard to what's going to happen to COVID. Now, you spoke a lot about the prices. What do you think about wages, with the fact that they might come back or might not come back while you're in the process of predicting? What do you think about wages, and how is that going to affect agricultural industry?
I mean, we know that wages are going up rapidly in cities because of the shortage. Right? And this actually happened during the plague as well. And there'll be a few months now where actually labor has a huge bargaining power in cities, precisely because of the shortage of labor. Right? And so we're already seeing construction industries flying people in, paying for, and basically pampering people to come back. Right? And so this is actually a great point, basically, for people who work on labor issues to kind of negotiate further. There's a historical parallel. During the plague also this happened, and the cotton textile industry had to give massive concessions to get people back to work. And those concessions stayed on. So for example, this system of wage in arrears completely got wiped out thanks to the plague, and they started getting wages on time at a higher frequency. So this is the kind of leverage one gets, because any shock like this changes the balance of power between capital and labor to a certain extent for some time. Whether it is going to be long lasting, I don't think so. I think this wage increase is going to be very, very short-term blip. But we know it's spinning down wages at the source end. And so there is rural distress now coming on from this mass unemployment. A lot of people are very gung-ho about, this is a great opportunity for investing in rural areas so that now people don't have to go back and so on. I think that is just completely misplaced. The smartest thing would be to get people back in safe conditions with all the sort of health protocols in place, where the employers actually, or the government steps in and gives that guarantee that we will pay for your COVID testing, we will provide the insurance. With that support, getting people back. I think that would be a much better strategy than trying to create something right now, for this short-term period.
So what is your view on the Interstate Migration Act and any kind of laws which might help or not help these kind of things?
Yeah, I think the Interstate Migration Act in any case applies to a really tiny percentage of overall migrant workforce in India, what we call a contractor base. I mean, your average person out here in India is not coming from a contractor. So in that sense, this is a classic debate again on organized versus unorganized, or the laws applying to organized. It's a really tiny share of the overall world. So to that extent, it anyway does not do that much. There's an argument that we should have more registration and so on. I'm also not too gung-ho on that aspect, because I think that that's an added layer of bureaucracy. People have to, every time you move, you have to get yourself registered and so on. So I'm more of a votary that let people get access to the welfare state anywhere in India. So, yes. And that which is now slowly happening. Portability of social security benefits, I think, has a much more powerful sort of potential impact than tinkering around with this Interstate Migrants Act. And this has to be widely publicized, because when they started a trial basis in Jan, and nobody really knew much about it. But what they're calling now is the One Nation, One Ration card, potentially, and that will automatically give you data. Right? So if a person is from Bihar with a Bihar-based Aadhaar card or whatever certification proof is required, is accessing something in Bombay, you automatically know then how many people are coming, as some andaz or some rough idea of that. So in a way, I think focusing on that much more than the Contract Labor Act, Interstate Contract Labor Act, I would say I'm more of a votary on that.
Right. So universal social security is definitely something that most labor economists and others have been arguing for, and including having PDS access. But on PDS, I sometimes worry that a lot of this migration, the way you've been also describing it, is male migration, and you have the male migrant coming over here. So this PDS universal access and being able to access it here, which is a good thing, of course, but then what happens to the families which are left over there?
Yeah, I think the operational aspects of this, because you're right that PDS is typically household level stuff. Yes. You access at the household level. What they've started on this pilot basis is that same household level thing extends to certain members of the family who can now take it at another place. But I think it also says in the trial basis that if you're going to access now in say Delhi, then you can't access it in Bihar for that one particular member. So what we will see, I think, is a movement towards an individual-based PDS from a household-based PDS, which is operationally slightly tricky in the first initial phases, but with the technology infrastructure in place, I think it should be reasonably simple. I don't see too much of a problem there. There is an issue with the fingerprinting, and let me come to that. That is, we found in some place there was a student of ours who did this study from Anantapur district in going to Bangalore. What they found was migrants were making an additional journey. It was of course short distance, so they would now, because you had to, in some places you have to press the button with your finger in order to access the release of ration, because it's in the family's name and because in a particular person's sort of thing. So that migrant now has to unnecessarily make an additional journey for that button press and then come back to the city. So that's another layer of thing which we not foreseen. That yes. So these are the kind of operational challenges that come up.
Yes. So all the sort of drum beating with regard to Aadhaar and Aadhaar fingerprinting. I mean, now we're having this problem with pensions, incidentally, because what they have done is that all banks, that thumb thing has been stopped because of the infection. So I don't know how the older people are getting their pensions.
Yes, absolutely.
And they say, okay, if you want it, you get messages which say, okay, if you want it now, you come to the office, where the pension office, on the Ashram Road. Who's going there? So, I mean, that must be happening to a lot of pensioners then, if this is the thing. So,
absolutely.
Beautiful advice when things are running well.
Yeah.
If not, yes.
The real issue with this portability issue is financing. That is, who should be paying for it? And anyway, our state governments, all of them are now fairly hostile. Almost all of them are trying to pass this 80% law for work for domicile, for local workers and so on. So now what will happen if you have One Nation, One Ration card? People say that this actually incentivizes migration, interstate migration. And so I can foresee a pushback from states saying that, we don't want to incentivize too much as well, because there's this political pressure to keep out interstate migrants on the other hand. And so just as the GST has an interstate council for goods and services, I think maybe it's a good idea to have an interstate council on migration, which can thrash out these fiscal issues. That is, if you're going to have an architecture on accessing social security anywhere in India, then obviously there will be fights, there will be disputes on who's going to pay for this. So even if we say the central government will do all the PDS, but at the ground level, somebody has to pay for this, last mile sort of connectivity. And so why should, say, Maharashtra government be paying for Bihari workers? So those kind of arguments might start coming up. And so I think it's more on the fiscal side where challenges might come up.
There's an interesting question here about data. Sorry, being a bit of a data person.
No.
It's a very good point. The point is, do we have good data with regard to seasonal migration? That's the broad question. It's not framed in that fashion. And then, what are the limitations of the NSSO data with regard to seasonal migration?
Yeah. So again, in much of my work, I have maps on seasonal migration again from the NSS. It gels very well with the field level data. Right? So I think the NSS is very good to pick out districts. Now the actual number may be less. In fact, I've shown that these are the map I showed you are underestimates. And I can say this because for Kerala, actually, you can compare the National Sample Survey with the Kerala Migration Survey, which CDS does for the year of 2007-8. Yes. And CDS, surveyed Kerala with thrice the sample size with similar questions. You can actually test the reliability of NSS, and it turns out NSS underestimates. Right? With seasonal migration, the question is right that it's underestimate and so on, but the districts get picked out fairly well. So the cluster around the borders of Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Rajasthan, which field studies have shown have massive seasonal outmigration, get picked up very well. So I think National Sample Survey data is also very useful just to know where the phenomenon is happening, and then you can actually go there and do your own studies and so on. So I remember sitting in Surat. I used to live in the lodge outside the railway station. A lot of my PhD research was on the railway, using the railway network. Yes. And every day I would, have these interviews with migrants, and then I'd go back to the lodge and I would check the NSS data, to see, okay, this is the response coming from the field, and what is the NSS data for the Surat sample telling me, right? And I think this is a good way of doing research, where you use a bit of field work to combine with what the NSS data is also telling. So quick answer, you can get some clues to seasonal migration, but issues like seasonal migration, where people are living, on the fringes of the city, where they're not covered by the sampling of the city. So they can be captured only in the source region. They can't be captured in the destination because those tents, those areas are not covered in the sampling frame of the NSS. It's not completely junk. That's what I'm trying to say. And you can always use this creatively and add on to studies that you're doing. Trafficking is another example, or say dam related displacement. You can't do that with NSS, for example, because it's a cluster which moves from one place to another place.
Yes.
It's not in the sampling frame. Your conclusion would be in India, nobody gets displaced.
Not there.
So you have to be careful with kinds of migration.
There was a question about, M.N. Srinivas has spoken about migration being a way of upward mobility. At least he was talking about the colonial period. So with all your engagement with migration and all your field studies, what is your take on that?
Yeah, broad answer, yes, I would agree. Yeah. Obviously, it depends on the place, right? So why is it that Udupi in coastal Karnataka and Saran district in Bihar, which were about equally poor in the late 19th century, both regions with mass outmigration, mass male outmigration for more than 100 years, continuing mass male outmigration, Udupi sex ratio even today is about 1,100 females to 1,000 males. But Udupi is one of the richest districts of India. It's the second, on the HDI of Karnataka, it's ranked second after Bangalore. Right? Whereas Saran is still, one of the poorest districts of India. Right? And so it tells you that it's not that migration, it refutes both. It refutes the argument that migration will never lead to any change, because it has led to change. And it also refutes this idea that, migration will definitely, lead to prosperity, because others, on that count, Bihar would be the richest part of India because it's got migration. I've argued that Saran has a mass migration history going back to the 14th century. Different armies that they've supplied labor all the way down to what seems to matter? So it's not just migration. It's migration plus the other factors which we know matter. education being hugely important. What migrants do when they go to the destination and invest in for the next generation, that is critical. And I've argued that in the case of Udupi, the guys who went to Bombay, for example, they invested heavily in education. They themselves would study. They opened night schools. So you have this famous guy called George Fernandez from this particular wave of out-migration. They opened night schools. So the migrants themselves came up. Every generation, the migrant quality in terms of skills went up. Right? So first they were completely laboring class. Then they were in the restaurants. Now they're owning the restaurants, the Udupi restaurants. So this is dramatic upward. This is a story of dramatic upward. The other thing that matters is establishment costs. Right? So for example, why is it that in one city like Surat, so this is again an example, you have the Saurashtra Patels who go to Surat. They're relatively poor, agrarian, but in one generation, massive upward mobility, however you measure it. Right? Compared to the guys from Ganjam who are going to the powerloom industry of Surat. So two sort of agrarian communities moving to Surat, but two different industries. One is in the powerloom, one is in the diamond. Right? And the diamond story is well documented. And it's because in the diamond, the establishment cost to start a basic karkhana or a workshop is about 5 to 10 lakhs. Right? But a powerloom industry, you can't start that. You need to have at least 1 crore or 2 in order to be able to start your own powerloom industry. So you have the skills, but you can't start your own. So what you see in the diamond industry is people, generation after generation, you work for 5, 10 years, and then you start your own establishment. And then you get your own family, and that's the cycle, the network-based cycle of upward. Whereas in the powerloom industry, you have the few sort of banya class who own it, and the labor who come and work for them. So it's, I think, a variety of factors which add on to the migration that eventually determine why some guys do better and so on. But the ultimate argument is caste. That is, as Ambedkar said, migration is liberating. Now, there are studies which obviously show that caste is hugely alive and kicking in urban areas. There's a study from IIM Bangalore which shows massive segregation even in cities and so on. But I would argue all of that is relatively less compared to villages. So if you look at segregation, the average Indian village is just completely, it's 100% segregation. If you use any segregation measure, it would be almost 100% segregation. Whereas if you define wards and sub-wards, it is not 100% in cities. Numerous studies on Dalit entrepreneurship show that when you're in an anonymous setting, that if you fail, because entrepreneurship, starting new businesses is a lot about failure. So there's a book by Devesh Kapoor on this. What they found was common between the success of a lot of these enterprises was migration. That is, the ability to fail was not looked down upon. If you were in your source region, people would say, just stick to your job, don't try and break out because you're going to be a failure. Whereas this idea of experimentation, failure, and then eventual success happens when that kind of pressure is not there. So I think there are interesting arguments on what can bring upward mobility. But on the whole, I would agree that migration is potentially a huge source of upward mobility. And ultimately, it comes off in the caste statistics of India. If you look at urbanization rates in India, or scheduled caste is 20%, all India we're saying 31%, what if the official statistics, and for Brahmins about 50%. So this is the very so when we also say that you should not have migration, it is a very patronizing attitude, because in a way the people who could migrate have already migrated, and now to say you should not get the benefits of mobility is very patronizing. So that's why I'm much more on the pro-migration side. Obviously, I know that not everyone benefits, but definitely on the pro-migration side.
There's an interesting question about UP, saying that you said that the world's largest migration pool comes from UP in the map. So they're asking, can you explain that?
Yeah, so one is, of course, UP is a big state, population.
Yeah, it's just sheer mass.
It's sheer mass. But even if you look at percentages, if you look at Azamgarh, Gorakhpur, note it's not all of UP, right? It's Eastern UP. And the reason is density. It's got, rural density. This is, cities by definition are dense, but in rural areas, if you see the average district in Madhya Pradesh and in Gorakhpur, Azamgarh, it's completely different. Right? Saran, the British used to complain that Saran is so dense that you can't do anything here, and it's a rural area. And so they had all these wonderful Tehsil level data on density saying and they had this theory that poverty and density are linked, which is not true, but they had this idea. So the reason why UP, Eastern UP and Western Bihar historically, but now all of Bihar, is such high labor pools is because of density. And note, I would argue that this migration from these places will not stop. Or I would say, since you've taunted me on predictions, till the next century. Right? So for the next 100 years, you do what you want in UP and Bihar, the migration won't stop. Right? And it will stop only when fertility rates start going down, which is substantially, which is several decades away. And one thought experiment to do is that UP and Bihar will take about maybe 3 decades to reach where Kerala is, maybe even today or in the short. So we look at fertility rates, we look at a variety of indicators. There's a massive difference, right? And we know what's happening in Kerala. I mean, quarter of the labor force is the fifth of the labor force is in the Gulf. So there is no guarantee that development stops migration. Density definitely drives, rural density definitely drives migration. And so if you're from UP and Bihar and in Gujarat, which means you're a migrant worker, definitely you will see these migration, and you should not see the migration necessarily as a sign that things are going bad. Which means, suppose the governments are there are doing fantastic for their people, it will upgrade the quality of migrations. Just like the people who are going from Kerala to the Gulf, that class has, that skill profile has completely changed in the last 40 years. There are about 5 Kerala migration surveys now to tell you the story. And so that is what you will see in UP and Bihar. You won't see migration stop, but you will see the quality of migration hopefully improve.
So now that you've provoked me about Kerala's migration, now that 1/5 of Kerala's, I have a joke on Kerala since I also come from there, that if all the people who have migrated out of Kerala were to go back to that tiny little strip of a state, then we'd not have space to even put a toe.
Yes.
So now with, most of your migrants to the Gulf coming back, what do you think, what do you predict for Kerala? Are they going to converge with UP?
Yeah, I mean,
obviously not, but
I think they'll move out of Kerala and go to other parts of India. That is the more rational part, or go to other places. I mean, the Kerala network also has been diversifying away from the Gulf. They've been going more permanently to Europe. To the nurse network, is now well entrenched in Europe,
yes.
in across the world. I mean, not just Gulf or Europe, even South America now. So I think a lot of communities you'll find, as I've joked in my book, only Antarctica is left.
For Kerala people to go, is it?
Virtually every part of the world, not just Kerala, but like there's a book called Sikhs in Latin America.
Yes.
This is a community which is now in Latin America, sufficiently entrenched for somebody to write a book called Sikhs in Latin America. So new destinations, and I think shocks like these. A lot of people say people have gone back, they'll never come. I think they'll come, but maybe not necessarily to the same place. Shocks often change destinations rather than the sources. And so you might find that the person who's disgusted with Delhi tries out something in Surat or tries out something in Bangalore, because they find on their stories that the Kerala government, reportedly treated the migrants fairly well. There were these accounts of that. If that is true, you might find people trying Kerala, saying that, this. And in my own conversation with migrants, Kerala definitely stands out as a state which provides you good facilities compared to many other states. And so a lot of migrants want to go to places which give you better labor conditions. And so.
Yeah. There's an interesting question about networking between migrants, and I'm not sure what is his logic for this, but if you can understand it, with this pandemic thing and these people coming back, do you think that there will be a kind of that network between the prior migrants and the ones that want to go now may be broken?
To some extent, I mean, there will be some short-term disruption for let me give this one example. My parents now living in Mumbai, and there's some painting work to be done in the house. Right? So now there's some original contacts which somebody would call up. It's quite likely that now, because those people have gone back, you try out new contacts, and so you get a new person, and you might find that person doing a better job, and that's how, as an employee, you've established a new rapport now with the person. So there's no doubt that to some extent that will happen. But still, on the whole, most people will come back. They will. They actually might not opt for the same employment contract if the employee literally threw them out in the first place. So they say, "Nahi, abhi unke saath nahi kaam karna hai." So that kind of attitude might reflect. But the migration back to the cities is inevitable. Again, now you'll find a few people who are disgusted and so on. But on the whole, on the thing, and the numbers from the railways are telling you, I mean, people are slowly trickling in back into the cities.
They're definitely coming back. The question is, what kind of jobs are they coming for again? And then, like you said,
there's mass unemployment. I mean, there's so many restaurants, which is this huge employment industry. You know, I mean, unfortunately, I mean, given the circumstances across the world, it's just shut down, and you know, so many restaurants are closing down. So even when migrants come back, there is a real issue of unemployment.
Yeah. So there are a few industries which are very badly hit. One is this hotel industry, the whole tourism industry, actually.
Entertainment, yeah.
Entertainment industry, and then also I don't know about construction. That might pick up, which takes up a lot of labor. If that picks up, then yes. So we are hearing about, you know, what I think you also spoke about it, where people are specialized people are being picked up and brought in to complete projects like the metro in Ahmedabad and so on and so forth. So that is a different kind of thing. There, of course, again, the wage rates will be an issue. We'll be paying higher wage rates and so on and so forth. All right. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. Sudhir, are there any other questions which I might have missed?
Yeah, there are a lot of questions that we have, and if you can
why don't you sort of
so I'll
bring out in some more which I might have missed.
So there is one question by Professor Sarthak. He's saying that with regards to the nutrition point, how effective is the idea of one nation, one card in tackling this problem? Rather than the suggested overhaul of the PDS system, as is being suggested by the likes of Zondre. So, would you like to comment on that?
I didn't fully get it. What the?
In the PDS system, where they're saying that one nation and one ration card.
Yeah.
That can be given to everyone, and then it can be through that system, this PDS can be managed effectively. Do you have?
I mean, obviously, one has to rethink the PDS system. I mean, we know there's a demand now for accessing PDS everywhere. So some of the old rules governing PDS will have to change. There's no doubt about that. What we would not, of course, want is to abandon the PDS stuff which has been working reasonably well in the source regions. Right? So nobody wants to abandon that, because that is a fundamental lifeline for many. But what we're thinking now of, and this PDS also in urban India, how does this access open out to more people? And so that is really the issue. Nobody's talking about completely changing the PDS and so on. It's just broadening access of the PDS. Now you can think of it in two ways. One is complete universalization, which a lot of people have argued, or make it more specific to migrants. I mean, you know, it's an open question, but on my end, definitely my sort of argument is that, you know, migration, migrant workers have to have the option to any access.
Yeah.
I'll take a question with, you know, I just saw a question here from Mr. Jafar on migration, saying there is no relationship between fertility and migration. There are many more factors for people. Yes, of course, we know that. What I meant by fertility and migration was very simple. Countries go through demographic transition, which means fertility rates start falling. Because density is a hugely important factor for migration. Density is increasing because of population growth. That slows down when fertility starts falling dramatically. We've seen this in the past in the case of Europe. India is not unique in having outmigration. Entire Western Europe in history is a history of outmigration to America. Why did that migration eventually stop? It was because the demographic transition played out and there was lesser pressure on those lands for people. So at a cross-section level, no, fertility doesn't drive migration. But on a time scale basis, as fertility rates fall, you have lesser population growth. And eventually, if you have, less pressure for people to go out. So that is really the relationship between fertility and migration, not over a cross section, but over a long period
of time. There was a short message by Professor Jeemol Unni. There has been some connectivity issue.
Okay.
There is one question particularly to you by Chandrika, and the question is, can you explain the Deccan Plateau phenomena? Why have people not migrated from there?
Why have people not migrated from Deccan?
Plateau.
Yeah, so the short answer is density, because you might want to ask, I'm talking about density so much. So why is it that density is so high in this thing? The answer is very simple. It's geography, right? I mean, there's a river. You have the Ganga there. Ganga, you have rivers in China where the massive civilizations have existed. So you have the Gangetic Plain, which has historically supported large populations. The Eastern UP Bihar cluster has even more, because if you realize, India's warfare history, that part was saved. The bulk of the wars happened on the sort of western end. So there's a particular, if you look at the history of habitation in India, Kerala, I mean, Kerala has been one of the most peaceful places, in relative terms in India, compared to, say, for example, Western India. You didn't have this mass warfare, mass murder, which means over time, habitations have sort of grown, and access to rainfall, access to water is where people have congregated on. Deccan Plateau is a dry region. It's a tough geographical terrain, and that is why people, have settled less out there in large numbers historically. And so today we have relatively less density. But there's another region, and that is the British networks. The British recruitment networks were coastal based. Right? So they operated out of Bombay, Madras, Calcutta. Right? And so, they really weren't in the Deccan in a very large way. Right? And a lot of the Deccan was actually princely state. A lot of the Deccan was the Nizam, Hyderabad state. It was the central India states, Gwalior, for example. So a huge part of the Deccan was not directly under the British. And so the British recruited from their provinces and not the Deccan. So the two principal reasons of how migration networks have emerged in India, density and historical recruitment networks, I think are good reasons to explain. That does not mean that no migration happens from the Deccan. And as I mentioned, Mehbubnagar, Raichur, Gulbarga, Sangli, I mean, I can go on, the list of districts. But we're saying in relative terms, compared to Eastern UP, compared to Kerala, it has relatively been landlocked, so to speak, in terms of migration.
Yeah, there is one question, and any one of you can take. This is from Professor Sonal, and she's asking that the migration theories focus on rural to urban and agriculture to industry and service sector migration. Pandemic has affected a large number of small and medium enterprises in which migrant workers generally get employed. Due to this, there will be a shortage of labor in urban areas, which oversupply of labor in the agriculture sector when people move from rural to urban to rural. Will this cause any impact on the wage rate in the long run, both in the industry and on the agriculture sector?
Yeah, I mean, this is what so Jeemol had asked. I think the short-term imbalances, obviously now we are seeing wage rates go up in cities. For the long run, not so much. And the reason is, the economic loss which has happened is quite immense. So though we are saying there's a labor shortage, as we were discussing, when people come back, there are also a lot of sectors where there's simply no jobs. Right? So this thing about less labor, but also less jobs available. It's an interesting time. It's very difficult to make a prediction on this, right? Compared to say what is going to happen for migration and so on, because there are many factors playing out in the labor market. And so all I'll say is that my assessment is that it's a very short-term disruption in terms of wages, but one really has to. I think we still really don't know the extent of losses that are happening on the ground. Right? For example, the GDP number, IIP number, most of this is organized industry. The growth rates that come from their organized, we saw this during demonetization. Growth rates in demonetization hardly went down. In fact, the demonetization year is now the highest growth year in Indian history. It's ridiculous because we've just not been capturing the growth or the fall of the MSME sector. So first is to get a sense of how bad the situation is, which I think all of us agree is quite bad. And then I think I'm definitely a votary of income support in this particular scenario where you have to have some fiscal stimulus to sort of put money in people's hands, so to speak, in order to tide over this crisis. And that's a macroeconomic issue, and I'm not any expert on that. But I think that's where the debate is heading right now.
There is one last question by Professor Raghavan Rangarajan, and the question is: do rural and urban employers prefer migrants? If so, is it related to lower wages, willingness to work longer hours? So why do they prefer these rural?
Yeah, this is a long-lasting question. Migration studies. Jan Bremen had famously studied this question in the context of South Gujarat, and he said that this is basically exploitation. I mean, firms prefer migrants over locals because you can basically harass, you can basically extract the most out of them. I think that would be a bit simplistic. My sense is that skills is paramount of importance. Many times migrants do bring in skills which are not available in the local industry. I mean, think of the US. It's not that the US have so many software workers out there. Indians are going there because there's a demand for software work. Similarly, in many parts of India, you have a demand for certain skills which migrants provide. In the case of completely low-skilled sector where labor is much more easily substitutable, maybe there is some truth to this. That is, farm labor, for example, prefers migrants. Because if you're taking, I mean, if you want to exploit migrant labor, it is true that you can exploit migrant labor much more effectively than your localized labor, right? Because localized labor might protest, might take you to court, and you can exploit migrant labor much more. This is what happens sometimes in the Gulf, right? Because the employer might keep your passport, and then you're completely at the mercy of the employer. So some truth to this element that employers, but I think it happens at a particular skill level. Whereas I think on other skill levels, it's really the skill requirements that drive migration. What's interesting is how recruitment happens in India. One is the contractor-based recruitment, but the bulk of migration for work in India happens through family caste networks. Right? So, and there are good studies on this. So, for example, this Surat network from Ganjam, how does a person know that there's a job in the parliament industry? It's because your family member has told you. And that family network means a caste network. So in that sense, there is employment in India is hugely driven by migration or migrant caste networks. And I think that is important to understand why. So preference for migrants differs across skill levels. In some places also, like I mentioned, UP, this is a question I get asked often, do Muslims migrate more than Hindus or Christians and so on? Right? This is like a propensity question. It so turns out that, in Eastern UP, they actually migrate more. In Kerala, they migrate more to the Gulf than other religions. But the bulk of the Muslims in India live in Western Uttar Pradesh. And you saw that map, Western Uttar Pradesh has very little out-migration. Right. So actually the bulk of Muslims, in the overall aggregate picture, there is no greater propensity of Muslims to move out. Now, if you turn back to this question of employment preference, it is not that you're employing, a Hindu or Muslim labor as a particular preference. Often it is just the source which is supplying, right? And how that network has been created over a period of time. So in the cotton textile industry of Bombay, you had a huge Muslim labor force coming from Azamgarh. Right? And just across the board, you would have a huge Hindu workforce coming from the Konkan. And these were caste or community-based migration networks that drew them there. And it is the case that many industries, there was simply no localized labor, or there was a combination of local and foreign labor. I can't think of too many industries where everything is migrant labor fed. Maybe the education sector. Like for example, the faculty at IIM Ahmedabad, there are very few Ahmedabad-born people. It's almost completely migrant-driven.
Thank you so much. Now I would request...
And potentially being exploited.
I just like to make a general point about the pandemic, since you, from the last question that Raghu had asked. With this pandemic, there's going to be some kind of a huge restructuring of the industry because, like we just pointed out, some of these industries are going to collapse, and some of the ways in which, like for example, trade, the way in which trade can take place, face-to-face selling might probably become much less, and that actually employs one hell of a lot of people. The mall activity might reduce. So there's, again, at least those mall activity has slightly higher weights than trading on the street and so on and so forth. So there's going to be a general restructuring, and certain things are going to pick up quickly, certain are just going to disappear completely. So I don't think I can predict, or anybody can predict, but I think something like the Niti Aayog or somebody should really, there was a time about 15 years ago when we used to do research when the economic reforms had just started, and we used to talk in terms of sunrise industries and sunset industries. Industries which are going to zoom now and industries which are going to collapse. Maybe something like that is going to happen now too, and it's too early for us to tell. And that will also then, the migration flows will then a little bit depend on how that goes. So I think at this point in time, it's for all of us to think and predict. So I think we should be closing now.
Yeah, thank you
and
so much.
At least let me thank Chinmay for this really interesting debate that we've had and your insights. We've been getting a lot of the chat messages and the question answer messages. I'm actually just thanking Chinmay for doing this. Some of my students are privately writing to say, thank you for having organized it, and so on and so forth. So very big thanks to Chinmay.
Thanks for having me over, and please do invite me so that I can ask you questions next time around.
Good one.
Definitely.
Yeah. Sudhir, you can close.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, and thanks to both of you. I formally close this. Thank you so much. I'll share the recording as well, because I've been receiving a lot of messages to share the recording of this particular webinar. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.